Hi, and welcome to Class 7 of Science Fiction Filmmaking 101. In this class, I'm going to talk about working with miniatures and practical models. Now, science fiction has always been that genre that made the most use of practical models and miniatures for things like spaceships and otherworldly landscapes. So for my second feature film, 2036 Origin Unknown, I didn't just want to rely on today's CGI, but instead I pushed hard for the producers to sign off on me utilising miniatures and practical models in order to create that same realism and feeling depicted in those space movies that had a huge influence on me growing up. The first miniature to be built was the space station known as the Orbiter, which is featured prominently throughout the film. That was actually one of my selling points to convince producers to spend budget and time on building models, because I wanted to always show the Orbiter in various angles and up close, which meant realism was super important. So the first step was to actually design the Orbiter. I worked with a CG artist to create the model in a 3D program called 3D Studio Max. We actually built it to scale with as much detail as possible, with each component having its own geometry. I wanted to play around with the design as much as I can at this stage, rather than in the fabrication stage, as that would be super expensive and a waste of workshop time. Once I was happy with the design, I then sent off the renders and the 3D file to the model makers at the workshop called the Model Unit, based in Ealing Studios. The Model Unit then proceeded to use the CG files to create some 3D printing of the components, as well as using it as a clear reference to start building the Orbiter. What was fascinating in the process was that the modelers took a kit bashing approach to applying as much detail in the model as possible by using mini Airfix kits, existing miniature components, and painting them grey before carefully etching in various details by hand to give that texture and depth to the surface. Now, some of you watching this are probably thinking, but yeah, 3D artists kit bash all the time when building CGI spaceships and objects. But what was special about doing it for real was that I was able to come into the workshop and review the model in a very tactile way, whilst the model unit team applied dirt, texturing and more details on the fly. We also did various lighting tests to explore how shadow and light would work with the materials, and with the cinematographer, see how all of this would be captured in camera to ensure the real-world realism of it being in space and lit by the sun. Most of these practical shots were then combined with visual effects to create the final scenes. For the early scenes involving the bay doors releasing the probe out into space, we built a miniature launch bay to scale. Now, the reason I went for practical as opposed to building it in full CGI was mainly because I wanted to capture sunlight in space as the doors open in a very optical way. We lit it as if it was an actual interior with strobing LED lights and subtle haze to give that eerie, cold space hangar feeling I wanted to convey in these scenes. Now, we shot these scenes at a high frame rate, at around 120 frames per second. This really gave it that weightlessness feeling you get in space, especially when things move, but also we're very fortunate to capture dust mote particles all in camera. To create the sense of movement with the space probe, we used the motion control camera rig with a rotatable axis head. We didn't want to rig up the model, as that would have been complicated to paint out in post. So instead of moving the model of the probe, we moved the motion control camera around to give the illusion that the probe was moving. It was actually a nifty trick the cinematographer came up with to give me full control on how I wanted to create the movement without compromising the model of the probe. We also moved a large light source around the model too. This actually created shadows moving across the surface of the model, giving the illusion of spinning in space. So in a nutshell, this was achieved via optical illusion. The other large model build was the alien cube itself. Now, this required special attention with details to achieve the sense of scale, especially when placed in the miniature terrain of Mars itself. One of the things we did was create the pattern of the cube surface in Adobe Illustrator. We then sent those images as vectors for the model team to 3D print the surfaces of each panel, which they will then use to construct a cube with. We also added tiny bits of clay, wear and tear, debris and dust to really make the cube sit into the Martian environment, but also paying attention to the size of the debris, since the cube is supposed to be a huge monolith type object. The Martian landscape had to feel real and had to be lit as if it was a real world place. So we created as much random geometric sections of the landscape in order to create a variety in the terrain structure. This was to give the illusion of an expansive landscape whenever we shoot in various directions or alternate angles. Now the model team carved these sections out using silicone foam, which they then coated with Fuller's Earth and spray painted to give that rocky terrain Martian texture I was after. With the combination of lighting and atmospheric dust on the set, we were able to give the terrain a realistic look and once again paying close attention to scale. The next thing we were building is the rover, and like the orbiter, we designed it in 3D first, referencing NASA's Curiosity Mars rover for inspiration. But unlike the other models, this one will have several moving parts and will need to be moved around on the terrain and be hit with weather conditions such as the Martian storms. Now our budget didn't stretch to actual motorized wheels, so we made it like a push buggy and focused on creating stabilized suspension in the wheels to create the illusion of a rover on hard terrain. Part of the rover includes the robotic arm, which plays a crucial part in the film to help build tension in the action of the rover on Mars. The team at the model unit did an amazing job with the look of the robotic arm, but this is one part of the model build I really wish I didn't do for real, as I was quite limited to what I could do on the day of the shoot, and working with battery-operated remote-controlled robotic arms can be a slow process to reset each time you do a new take, especially on a crunched schedule. So this is one example where a CGI robotic arm would have worked much better, giving me more freedom to do what I wanted with the movement. But saying that, the roughness in the way the robotic arms moved and the odd stopping and starting actually gave the rover robotic arms a realistic kind of vibe to it, especially with the fact that this is a Martian rover controlled via transmissions on Earth. So although it did work aesthetically, from a production point of view, I would have gone CGI on this one. So in general, creating miniatures and models really gives the sequences a level of texture that really heightens the gritty realism that the movie needed to tell this story in the most grounded way possible.